Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on journal peer review. My name is Sin-Mong Chong. I'm the convener of BIRA's ECR network. On behalf of the team of the network, I would like to welcome all of you here. This is our third installment of our webinar series on journal peer review. We have had two webinars in the past 2 months focusing on journals in different disciplines and fields. We had one on educational technology, we had the other one on higher education, and today we have one on language education. Before I introduce our guest today, I would like to just briefly introduce the network. So the ECR network of BIRA is, of course, passionate about providing supports, all sorts of support to early career researchers in educational research. We organize regular events, mostly online because of the pandemic, but we're gradually resuming some of the face-to-face events, hopefully next year. So we have the webinar series on academic writing that you are now attending. We also have a symposium series where researchers, doctoral researchers, can present their work in progress in a very safe space and to receive feedback from senior academics. We also have blogs and podcasts on various issues about early career researchers. And we also have a number of awards. For example, we run the Undergraduate Thesis Award. We also have a Career Development Fellowship to support the development of early career researchers. So today it's one of our efforts to kind of demystify the peer review process of journals. And I'm very, very happy to have journal editors offering us insiders' perspective and their firsthand experience of editing their own journals. And today I'm very, very privileged to have Associate Professor Rita Elaine Silfer here with us from Singapore. So I'm going to briefly introduce Rita, and I'm going to hand over to her to walk us through the journal peer review process and maybe some of the tips that she will share with us when submitting to her journal. But before I do that, I just want to ensure everybody knows the rundown of today's event. So it will be a 19-minute event. So for the first hour, Rita will give us a short presentation on various aspects of journal peer review. In the last 30 minutes, it's reserved for question and answers. Of course, you're most welcome to type your responses, your comments, your questions in the chat during the talk, and then Rita will be able to pick them up after the presentation. Of course, after the presentation, if you would like to raise your hands and ask the questions yourself, you're most welcome to do so. So let me introduce our speaker today. Rita Elaine Silfer is an associate professor in English language and literature and associate dean for research design and integrity at National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Her research interests are in classroom language learning, classroom pedagogy, classroom discourse, and in open science and research ethics for applied linguistics. Rita has been and is an editor of Language and Education, the journal, and was previously a co-editor of Pedagogies, an international journal. She's on the editorial board for Language Policy, Educational Linguistics, and Journal of Immersion and Content-Based Language Education, as well as being on the editorial review board for TESOL EJ and TESOL Journal. She has published in numerous scholarly journals, including International Journal of Multilingualism, AERA Open, International Journal of Science Education, Journal of Teacher Education, International Journal of Sociology of Language, Language Policy, Cambridge Journal of Education, and Journal of Educational Change. Her most recent book is The Role of Language in Content Pedagogy, a framework for teachers' knowledge. I'm sure you know now that Rita has a lot of experience editing journals, serving on editorial boards, being a peer reviewer of various journals. So I'm very, very happy that to have you here, Rita, with us. Thank you very much, and I'll hand over to you.
So now I'm hoping you can see me, you can hear me, and you can see my slides. Is that right?
Yes, yes.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so much for that warm welcome, and thank you so much for having me here. I am really on board with this idea that we need to talk with early career scholars about what happens in the publishing process. I know it seems quite mysterious to people, but it shouldn't be mysterious. I think it's just a matter of having a venue like this where we can talk about it and we can share our ideas and we can tell you a little bit more about what happens from the editorials side. So, I'll be talking mostly about my own journal, Language and Education, which you can see there on the screen, but I'll also be referring to my experiences as a scholar and toward the end also a little bit my experience as an author, because I don't think I can talk about being an editor without also being aware of how my editorial work fits in with my larger scholarship and my own attempts to be an author. So let me go ahead and jump in. I basically plan to cover three broad topics. An overview of academic publishing. I want to talk a little bit about perceptions, purpose, and audience. And then I want to talk about some of the current issues in academic publishing. These aren't specifically related to peer review, but I think it's important information to have a broader understanding of what exactly goes on in the publishing world and how it is related to scholarship as well as university perspectives on academia and scholarship. And then at the end, I'll get down to some of the nitty-gritty of what editors look for, and in particular, what I look for when I'm editing a piece that has been submitted to my journal. So I think first, if we do the overview of academic publishing, of course, there's many ways that we could look at this, but there are two views that I think are particularly helpful. The first, because it seems to be quite a dominant point of view, a rather traditional point of view, and this is the one-way view. You can see this on Wikipedia, for example. So you can see it's really kind of the public-facing view of what academics do. And that's the idea that we distributed our academic research and scholarship via publications. And so we imagine that frustrated scholar sitting in his or her own room, busily trying to write things up and send them off, and hoping that they will get published and picked up and used by somebody somewhere. So in this one-way view, it's the person who is the scholar preparing something and just sending it out. But the other view of scholarship, or the other perspective that I think is probably more useful, is the community view that Storch talks about in 2013. And this idea, our publications, our dissemination, our scholarship is not a one-way communication, but instead is an attempt to participate in a larger academic discourse community. In that sense, everything that you write is responding to something that's already under discussion in community and attempts to participate in that conversation, hopefully with other people also responding back to you or taking up your ideas, whether to refute them, to applaud them, to improve on them. I find this view to be much more helpful and to think about academic discourse in this way. It helps us better understand as well why some articles seem to fly and some don't, why we get some kinds of comments from peer reviewers in different ways. And I think it also shows that the author isn't just an isolated person, but is actually a participant in this whole process. So of course, we're actually doing both. We're disseminating information, but we're also participating in a scholarly community through our dissemination and our publications. Questions that we need to ask ourselves then are, what is it we want to communicate? What's the purpose of our particular piece that we're submitting to a journal, but also what's the purpose perhaps of a longer trajectory of work that might over time go to multiple journals or might appear even repeatedly in the same journal over time? And with whom do we want to communicate? What is our audience? Again, what's our audience for this specific piece? And what's our audience in general for the work that we are building up over time and that we want to share? And I think it's important to note that we don't necessarily always have the same purpose or the same audience, even for the same research study or the same set of findings. And so that influences the decisions we make about what we're submitting, where, when, and for whom. So we can see here different types of publication, of course, monographs, a book chapter in an edited book, a newsletter perhaps for professionals such as teachers or other people who are involved in the research enterprise in some way. That might even include librarians or research data managers. Newspaper, we might write articles for the public, including opinion pieces or news pieces, as a way of helping communicate what our research means to the broader public, particularly if we are trying to get publicly funded money. And of course, professional publications that are intended for teachers that are not just newsletters, but those might in themselves be journal articles or books, but a different type of journal article from those very academic journals. Social media, of course, is a big area for disseminating your work and for communicating with your audience, for talking about ideas. What I'll focus on today is journal articles, and in particular, journal articles for international audiences or journal articles that have international outreach. There are also, of course, local journals, regional journals, and those are other things that you can consider for disseminating your work, depending, again, purpose and audience. That leads to the idea that we have to grapple with in terms of choosing a journal. So you have an idea for a research article based on some research that you've been doing. You need to think about where you want to submit this piece of work. I always encourage people to think about potential journals even before you start writing. So when I start to write an article, as much as I'm thinking about what my purpose is, when I think about my audience, I try to think very specifically 2 or 3 journals that I'm aiming for when I'm writing that article. I find it very helpful because it gives me an idea of who I'm talking to as I write. Always, when I'm writing an article, I imagine an audience out there somewhere who'll be reading it. But choosing the journal is really an important part of the process for me. But of course, there are a lot of things to consider, including reputation, whether it is a journal that is well known, whether it is a journal that you would trust with your work, whether it is a journal that would be recognized as you move ahead in your career. And so we talk about IRJ's, International Referee Journals, but among those, there are also different categories, those which are SSCI listed, those which are ranked in different ways. So you can look to see if it is SSCI listed as one way of determining whether the journal has a solid reputation. But honestly speaking, the SSCI listing is huge. And so that doesn't necessarily tell you that that journal is reputable or that that journal is the journal that you would want to distribute your work in. I don't mean to say that journals on the SSCI list are not reputable, but perhaps what I should say is which ones are more well-known or less well-known. You can also look at who is on the editorial board for a journal. If you look at an editorial board, at least in my opinion, you should see some well-known people in your field. But I would also expect that you would see some people that perhaps you don't know as well. If the only people you see on the editorial board are the people who have been around forever, definitely they have a lot of expertise to offer if they are helping to steer the journal or offer their opinion. But we also know that it's very good for journals to have new journal members, to have some new blood, to have some fresh insights. And so when I look at an editorial board, I'd like to see a mix of people with different expertise, different tenures, and perhaps different places around the world. Depends on what you're looking for. So take a look at that journal editorial board and see how it speaks to you and what does it show you about the journal. And finally, choose a journal that you would read. If it's not a journal that you would read, it's unlikely it's a journal that would publish the work that you're preparing. Finally, and most importantly, aims and scope. Every presentation that you ever hear by a journal editor, probably the other 2 in these series, the ones that are hosted at conferences, we always say repeatedly ad nauseum, consider the aims and scope. There's a reason why every journal website has a section where they explain the aims and the scope of the journal. So here's an example, language and education. So if you go to the journal website, you'll see a variety of information there. You can see the impact factor, which is one way that people use to gauge sort of how reputable it is, how much it is used by other scholars. You can see the ranking. I'll talk about those things more in a minute, but I'd like to draw your attention to the underlined portions. It's a forum for discussion of recent topics and issues in language and literacy, which have an immediate bearing on thought and practice in education. So 3 key words there: language, literacy, education. So this is something to think about. If you're preparing an article, does your article have to do with language and or literacy? Does it have something to do with education or educational impact? Reading further, it says one or more of the following: policy, curriculum, pedagogy, evaluation, and education. That's pretty broad, but it shows you that we're very serious about the educational component that is in our title. This means for language and education, articles that are purely theoretical linguistics would not be appropriate. It might be a wonderful article, it might be a great research study, but it doesn't fit in this particular journal. We always are looking for educational implications. So again, this idea of that link between language literacy and education must be in every article. But reading further, there's more information. And this, I think, is really important. Read the whole aims and scope, not just the first paragraph, because most of the aims and scope that I have seen start with a general explanation, and then they move into those details, which are very important for helping you make a decision. This is where you can see language and education is different from a number of applied linguistics journal. And this is also why I consider it to be an educational linguistics journal more than applied linguistics. We include articles that are related to the dominant language of the country, society, and educational system. Language and education is not an EFL journal. It is about the dominant language in the country or the society or the education system. But what does that mean? And we've actually had a lot of discussions about what we think this means. So we added this additional sentence. It includes mother tongue and second language education, issues related to immersion, content-based language teaching, CLIL, multilingualism, medium of instruction. But it does not include foreign language education, modern foreign language education. So, for example, if the article is about English medium instruction in Japan, that could potentially fit. But if it's about English learning as a foreign language in a Japanese tuition center, that would not fit within language and education. As the editor and an applied linguist, I have to say I understand this is a very fuzzy boundary, and we have had a lot of discussion about exactly what it means. But if you go back to our very first issue back in 1987, this has always been the stance for this journal. It always included components of language and literacy linked to education, primarily for the dominant language or the first language, as they said back in those days. Now we realize that the first language doesn't quite work because there can be more than one, and it's not always the first in order to be the dominant. My point here is you have to read carefully the whole aims and scope. Check example articles to see if those example articles match up with the way you understand the aims and scope. And if all else fails and you're still not sure, go ahead and email the editor and say, this is the title I'm thinking of, this is the abstract, is it a good fit or not? Most journal editors will reply to you and let you know whether they think it fits within the aims or scope. And if the editor doesn't reply to you, that also tells you something about the journal. Now here for comparison is one of our sister journals under Taylor and Francis, Language, Identity, and Education. And I raised this example because as you see with the underlined blue, it starts out again general, but when you go to the second paragraph, you can see language, identity, and education is quite different from language and education. It must have a central focus on second, foreign, minority, heritage, or indigenous languages. That's already a big difference from what language and education does. It must have an intersection with identity and or education. And if you read on, they have a long list of example articles to help you tease apart exactly what that earlier paragraph meant and what kinds of studies they would accept. So just from these two, you can already get a sense of which of these journals might be appropriate for some kinds of studies that you could be undertaking. One more example, if we look at language learning, which is one of the most well-known and most long-standing journals in applied linguistics, you'll see it's again quite different in terms of the aims and scope. A scientific journal dedicated to the understanding of language learning broadly defined, systematically applied methods of inquiry, fundamental theoretical issues. Reading this the first time, really, I was like, what does that mean? I'm not sure what that means. But when I compare it with the other two journals, I start to get a sense that language learning is potentially more theoretical, has a broader scope in terms of what it interprets for language learning. For example, it doesn't require that intersection with identity or education that language and identity and education does. It doesn't require that focus on the dominant language of the community or school that language and education does. So by comparison, I can start to get a better sense of how these journals are different. And again, of course, look at the articles that are published and see how those articles make sense to you in terms of the aims and scope that you read. All right, so that's the first big tip in terms of thinking about journal selection. Take your time to read the website information. If you're not sure, go ahead and check with the editor. Follow the required information in the online submission. This, I know, seems so obvious. After years of schooling, we all know we're supposed to follow instructions, but people do get tripped up. They skip steps. They think it might not be important. If it's in the online submission system, it's important. Be sure your submission is anonymized. People can get tripped up here by making their name anonymous, but forgetting to take out contextual information or references to themselves throughout the article that could be problematic. Journals handle this in different ways. Some journals will allow you to refer to yourself or your previous work in the text of your article, as long as using third person, so it's not my article. Other journals will ask you not to refer to your own work, but if wherever you refer to your own work, to use author, for example, author 2012. The main issue, of course, is we want the submission to be anonymized as much as possible. So when it goes to the peer reviewers, they will hopefully evaluate it based on this specific presentation and not based on the author's reputation. Include statements on any conflict of interest, any grants that you've had, etc. That information might be in the cover letter to the editor initially, so it doesn't reveal your identity. Of course, be sure to use academic language. Clear writing is essential. And the final thing that you have to know is the editor's decision is always final. As one of my colleagues says, who's also a journal editor, this isn't a democracy, and that can be very hard to take. What we do try to do is incorporate the peer review process so that if it's not a democracy, it's at least not a complete autocracy where the editor has the only say. The editor's decision is always final based on their interpretation of the reviewer comments, the aims and scope of the journal, the quality of the article, but also what they think the journal needs coming up in the next few issues for which they're selecting articles. That's the overview. Let me move on now to some of the current issues in publishing, in academic publishing that I think that you need to be aware of. Ratings, rankings, publication quality, which I have mentioned, publication versus impact, open science, and idealization of scholarship. I bring in this section because publish and perish is a real phenomena in our field and in all of academia, but it's not the whole story. And I'm hoping as you move forward in your career and you think about your publication and dissemination of research, that you don't only think about academic publishing in the so-called top-tier journal in your field. So let me talk a little bit more about what I mean. First, just to deal with ranking. I've already mentioned SJR, which is one way of ranking journals. You can look this up online. There's also JCR, which many journals refer to when they try to determine the quality of the journals that you're publishing in. This is a paid service, so you may or may not have access to it when you're checking potential journals for publication. But if you go to the journal website will always tell you what their ranking is because they want you to know. They want you to know where they stand in the rankings. This is actually almost a kind of a marketing ploy, especially if it is a good ranking. If you look across fields, different fields, of course, have different ideas of what constitutes a high ranking. In education, the rankings tend to be higher. In applied linguistics, I'd say rankings over 1, 1.2, etc., are a good journal. So we have to think about this. What does top tier mean? I would encourage you to go for top tier journals. If you have good research and you have good ideas, it's true that top tier journals will get your research the attention that you want it to have. Going back to the idea of a community of scholars who are sharing ideas with each other, it's simply no fun writing an article and not having anybody join in a conversation with you about it. So do go for those top tier journals. You can check something like SGR, which I already mentioned, by the journal ranking, country ranking, or different kinds of visualization tools. What you'll see when you go to their website is this orange box. You type in the name of the journal, for example, language education. It gives you the list of titles that are similar. You click on the one you want. You can see the country where it's published, the subject areas, who the publisher is, how long it's been around, and the H index, which is one way of understanding the number of citations or the quantity of citations given for this journal overall, not for a specific article or a specific scholar. I'm not going to go into details on H-index. You can look that up if you don't already know it. But one way we compare journals is by seeing their H-index. And so again, my example articles here, my example journals, Journal of Language, Identity, and Education has an H-index of 25. So that's lower than language education. Does that mean it's not as good? I wouldn't say so. What we already saw is it has a more specific focus, integrating this component of identity. Therefore, it might not get as many submissions, and it might have a little bit more of a niche journal aspect to it. Language learning, of course, one of the prominent journals in the field for ages, has a higher H index. Does that mean it's necessarily better? What we saw from the aims and scope, it depends on what you want to communicate and who your audience is. There are some things that could be published in language education and not in language learning because of the scope of the journal. When you look at SGR, you see all those other kinds of information as well. You can see similar journals and their similarity index. You see the tiles, which show you historically how the journal has ranked. Green tiles mean it's considered to be in the top quartile or quartile 1. In this case, for both education, linguistics, and language. You're looking not only for the quartile, but for consistency. So you can see language and education has been in the quartile 1 since 2007 for linguistics and language, and on and off for education, but consistently from 2018. And there's more. I'm not going to go into all of these details. You can look at this information if you like, but the box there at the bottom that I put the border around is where you can clearly see quartile 1 journal and what they call the SNP, which is a way that they try to assess the impact of this journal overall. Again, not a specific article, but in general, what kind of an impact does this journal have? Again, I would say over 1 is a decent impact factor. Finally, it shows you the ranking of journals and in your field. So this one is for linguistics and education. And I just want to highlight to you here. So remember I said language learning, the H index is 112, which is very high. And yet language learning is not ranked as the top journal. That top journal is ranked as Modern Language Journal, at least in this ranking scheme. So why is that? Because the way the rankings are done is different. The H index is calculated in one way. The SNP factor is calculated in a different way. The citations are calculated in yet a different way. all of these different metrics are information you can use, but none of them is the correct answer on which is the best journal. It's really important to highlight this. And in the future, it's also really important if you have to talk to your head of department or your university about why you picked a particular journal for your publication. It's not just about ranking, it's not just about the H index, but there are different metrics that you can refer to show the quality of the journal that you picked and what constitutes top tier for what you have in mind to publish. So here I just mentioned journal metrics. If you go to language and education, you'll see something in this drop-down menu that shows the journal metrics. And what we show about journal metrics has really changed over time with more and more information and more variety in the different types of metrics that you could refer to. You can see on the left the annual downloads. Downloads, of course, are very important as we move to a system which has more online publications. You can see the impact factor, then the Q1 impact factor that I just showed you, 5-year if, a site score, the SNP, the SJR. All of these are different metric systems that you can use to compare against other journals, but also to support that you have in fact chosen a high quality journal for your publication. And in this case, we also show our information about speed or acceptance rates. If that's particularly important to you to know how quickly you'd be able to get your article out, you might want to look for this information. Not all journals publish this information, so you would have to check across journals. But I note that while all this information is helpful, never forget that it's also a kind of marketing. So I can say this as the editor for my journal. We want you to know this because we think this is information that's good for you, but also that speaks well of the journal. Okay, so all of this stuff about rankings, does it really matter? There's the dissemination, there's the quality, there's the impact, and we know that reducing it down to these metrics doesn't tell the whole story. Top tiered as determined by rankings isn't always your best choice. I said I think you should go for top tier journals, which I do, but that doesn't mean I think you should always go for the #1 ranked journal because it might not be the most appropriate for what you want to convey in that particular research study. So do bear in mind impact factor and all of these metrics I just showed you are actually quite a limited way of showing your impact and dissemination. On the other hand, if you're trying to get a job, if you're trying to get promoted, if you're trying to get tenure, these things matter and they do provide some sort of an indication about how widespread your research is. So I think I would propose is you want to know this information and you want to consider this information, but you don't want it to be the only thing that you can consider. And that brings me to the idea of publication versus impact. Is beginning to be a larger conversation in scholarship about impact and what it means for your research to have impact beyond publishing in research. Actually, for more than 30 years, people have been talking about researchers doing research purely for other researchers. And there is something to be said for that. This would be in PURAC's scheme of basic research we do for other researchers. But a part of our research efforts, especially as applied linguists or educational linguists, is often going to be those collaborations between researchers, innovators, teachers, schools, policymakers, where we're trying to think about ways to encourage continuous improvement in learning processes, in educational processes, in teacher professional learning. These sorts of articles are not basic research, and they would likely be published in different kinds of journals, but they can be very impactful and very important in our field. A long history of these kinds of journals has really helped us rethink how we work with our students in language classrooms and how we work with potential teachers in language teacher education. So it's a very important component of our research. And then, of course, there's research where evaluation is undertaken to support continuous improvement. We actually have very few evaluation studies in our field. They're hard to do, they're hard to get support for, but they're very important. A question to ask is which of these is likely to get published in what kind of journal, which ones might be top tier. Basic research, of course, would be considered as fundamental, would go into top-tier theoretical journals, but it might not be the most impactful in terms of really changing our field or providing useful information for our language learning and teachers. So if you go to this next quote from Reed et al. From 2021, we define research impact as demonstrable and or perceptible benefits to individuals, groups, organizations, and society that are causally linked to research. What I noticed with this definition is it doesn't say anything about rankings or citations. It doesn't talk about top journals. What it's really talking about is how does it demonstrate an impact, a benefit to someone else. If you can track the benefit of your research above and beyond citations or separately from citations, this can be very important and very persuasive as you move forward in your career. At my own institution now, at NIE in Singapore, we're actually working very hard to think about what impact it might mean in the local context and globally as we think about our research. This really relates to what types of impact are valued by whom and what types of impact you wish to achieve with your research. So while I encourage you to go for those top tier journals, I would also encourage you not to spend all of your effort on top tier journals, but to think about a balance for different kinds of impact and different kinds of dissemination. One example of a different kind of dissemination is an effort which is the OASIS. If you haven't heard about it, it's the Open Accessible Summaries in Language Studies. It's not related to any journal. It doesn't have anything to do with rankings. What they do in this effort is after you publish a journal article, for example, in language education, after it's accepted, you would be asked to write an accessible summary, a summary in lay language, everyday language that anybody could understand and read. It could be helpful to teachers, to policymakers, to parents, or to people in the community. It's published open access, it's online. And what OASIS does is they work with various journals such as Language and Education so that they are sure that the research is well done. They don't evaluate the research quality, but they make it accessible to a broader community. So this is a really good effort for disseminating your research. First, in a journal publication where you get your top tier hit for your university. Next, in OASIS, so that you get more downloads, more dissemination to a broader audience and other people who are interested in your work. In this way, same research study, same research findings, but you're getting two kinds of dissemination. Another thing to think about is open science, and I refer to open science as something that is really positive and that I would really encourage, but I also recognize that open science has a particular perspective on research, which I consider to be somewhat of an idealization of scholarship. Many things that happen under the umbrella of open science include accessible summaries, which I just mentioned, and OASIS is not the only one. There are other kinds of accessible summaries published in education and in other fields. Also, of course, open access publications. You can publish in open access journals. You can publish an open access article in language and education. You can publish open access data, open access materials. You can do pre-registered reports. All of these kinds of things are supported by the Open Science Foundation, which again is not tied to any specific journal, but supports these efforts in general for scholarship. Different journals take different approaches to supporting different kinds of impact. Language and Education, for example, recommends that you submit an accessible summary to OASIS, but does not require it. Language and Education also supports open access, open data, open materials, and pre-registered reports through Open Science Foundation badges. So we are trying to actively encourage all of our authors to think about broad kinds of dissemination, including sharing your data, sharing your materials. This leads to the question for some of why would you want to share? For example, why would you want to share your data? And I just mentioned as a journal editor, this is particularly powerful. I think as well in applied linguistics, we do a lot of human subject-based research that's extremely time intensive. We take up a lot of our participants' time. We take up a lot of our own time to get the research done. And then the data is filed away somewhere. And I'll just share with you two personal stories linked to this. Years ago, Patsy Lightbound did a presentation at a conference where she referred to the data in the cabinet. She had a locker in her office where she had all the old data, which she was certainly going to reuse. And while she was saying this, she was laughing at herself because for years she had said she was going to reuse this data. And I would have to say I'm the same. I have a cabinet full of data that I fully intend to reuse someday, somehow, but haven't. If I share that data with other people, it's a huge advantage to the field because it really reduces our costs. It encourages our opportunity to share. It allows for more kinds of comparison. It's extremely powerful. I will give you a contrary example. A friend of mine in another field, which has to do with neuroscience, one day said, I'm going to go down to the lab and prepare my conference paper. Oh, I thought that would take a long time to get ready. The other person said, well, I'll just run the experiment and then I'll run it a couple more times to make sure the results are okay, and I'll write it up. And I couldn't believe it. I'm like, you can do that in one day? Oh, sure. It's just an experiment. You run it on the computer. There may be some kinds of applied linguistic research that works that way, but not most of it. So I think this idea of data sharing, material sharing is really important in our field because of the costs that we have. Right, so again, I already mentioned some journals support open science efforts in different ways. Here are the different kinds of badges you can get, and I won't go into that in any more detail. You can just look for that online if you're interested. All right, taking this a little bit further and talking a little bit more about open access, Hagner talks about open access and says experiences of recent years have shown that open access is far more complex than the optimistic standard narrative would lead us to believe. When people started with open access publishing, I think there was a real idealized view that we would put our publications up, anybody anywhere could read it for free. It's a little bit trickier because somebody somewhere is paying for the research, somebody somewhere is paying for the editing, somebody somewhere is doing all the formatting. And so this idea that open access is truly free is actually not true. If we think about this, one issue that open access tries to address is publishing is really a commodity. When you publish your work, you're putting a commodified output out there that somebody else will hopefully take up and use. They don't pay you cash, but they pay you in citations. And so we do see the commodification of academic publishing as people try to publish in those high-ranking journals to get the citations in popular topics that other people will read and not necessarily the topics that may be most pressing or most needed. So we have to be aware this fact that our research can be commodified, and we have to think about to what extent that benefits us, doesn't benefit us, benefits the field, or does not benefit the field. Having said that, you should be a little bit warned about your research becoming a commodity or idealizing scholarship too much. There's some of these open science efforts. I also have to go back to the idea that if you don't disseminate your research, it's really a waste. It is fruitless in the most explicit sense, right? If the knowledge is meant to be shared, you have to put it out there somewhere. So now I'm going to get to the crux of the talk, and I think the part that you probably really want to hear what our editor is looking for. The first part is the standard stuff. Okay, so Lee in 2011 actually looked at top-tier environmental health sciences and toxicology journals, not in our field at all, but this was an interesting article because Lee compared so-called top-tier journals to see to what extent the editors seemed to be looking for more or less the same thing. They found the submission processes were pretty much similar. The evaluation criteria was pretty much similar. What the information they had about peer review, pretty much similar. And then papers that are relevant to the scope of the journal, innovative, significantly advance the field, well written, adhere to the instructions, this should be sounding familiar, are much more likely to be accepted. So these are all the things that I mentioned at the beginning as the basic tips. They also found that editors advise potential authors to ensure the topic of the papers within the scope represents an important problem is carefully prepared. So now we move on to thinking about some of the more fine-grained details that make the decision between an accept and a reject, or even between a reject and a revise and resubmit. I note that Lee 2011 also included this comment on getting editorial assistance if English is not the primary language of the authors. This is actually quite contentious in terms of how we evaluate the writing quality. So you'll see my burning question over here. Editors have a very hard time dealing with this. I think that most journals in applied linguistics now are moving away from an explicit native speaker standard, whatever that is. And of course, that's one of the problems. We don't really know what that is. But what we are looking for is clarity. So there has to be clear writing, and there has to be a writing style that would be commonly accepted by your audience of other academics. So now, all right, so going back to what I said, aims and scope, I won't repeat that information, but a few other things that are equally obvious. In terms of evaluation criteria, now the submission and peer review process. For language and education, it's a double peer review, which means that the reviewers don't know who the author is, the author doesn't know who the reviewers are. We also solicit at least 2 peer reviews for every piece. I'll tell you a little bit more. If I get 2 peer reviews back with widely divergent opinions, and when I look at the submission, I can't understand why those opinions are so divergent, I will try to solicit a third opinion. Similarly, if I think one of the reviews is weak for some reason, and the other review is not sufficient, I will try to get a third peer review. The problem with trying to get a third peer review, it takes longer because you get the first 2 peer reviews back, and then you have to still search for another peer reviewer who gets another month to look at the article. So sometimes, even if I feel that the 2 peer reviews are not in sync, instead of sending it to a third person, if I feel I can reconcile those opinions, I will go ahead. Because we're always trying to work with a high quality peer review process, but also the issue of time that comes into play when we talk about peer review. Of course, the article should be innovative, new. It should advance the field in some way. I would say along with this, advance the field doesn't always mean something new, but could be a replication study, could be a way of re-looking at something previously published, putting a new spin on it. So the advance the field component of that statement is by far the most important. And it has to be written for an international audience. Does this article speak to issues that other researchers, other scholars, internationally would be interested in? Perhaps it is based only in Mexico, but is the issue that is being talked about relevant to a broader international audience, or is it only local or only regional? And of course, clarity in writing. So my editorial comments would be, of course, those that are on the right. A few additional comments here. Include a brief cover letter for unusual but relevant information. You don't always have to include a cover letter with your submission. If you do include a cover letter, it should be short and sweet. The cover letter really is only necessary if there are some particular things you need to let the editor know. For example, it's based on my PhD thesis. It's part of a larger study. You could put these comments in the cover letter because that might influence how we view the article. Do seek editorial assistance if needed, but I would say actually anybody should always have somebody else read their submission before they submit. I do try to always have my co-author or my colleagues read my articles before I submit them to the journal, and invariably they catch things that I missed. Some of the things that might be a little less obvious. Reviewers are selected for expertise, of course, but it takes time to find reviewers. From the editor's perspective, this is one of the hardest parts of our job. Not all reviews are equally useful. As editors, we recognize that some of the reviews we get back aren't really what we had hoped for or might not be very helpful to the author, but the reviews should be shared. So this is where it's a little bit dicey. If the reviewer sends back a review that's not particularly helpful, do we share it with the author or do we withhold it? If we withhold it, are we in some way subverting the peer review process? Do authors really need to see the evil reviews that sometimes come back? Does the editor need to help interpret reviews? I can't answer this for other editors, but my process is if a review comes back that I think is not particularly helpful, I will try to send it on to the author and I will say, this was the second review. I don't think it really helps you with your work. I include it in case you want to see what the other person said. I do always try to help you interpret what the reviewers have said because reviewers aren't always clear. In terms of your responses to the peer review process, this is critical. You really must take all review comments seriously. Sometimes getting a reviewer comment can be aggravating. Our first response is almost always, you didn't read it carefully, or you didn't understand what I meant. I can say this because I have the same reaction every time I get back reviews that are not what I would want them to be. I set it aside a few days and I look at it again. I almost always find something valuable in the peer review comments. You don't necessarily have to agree with everything that the peer reviewers say, nor do you have to mindlessly implement everything that the reviewers tell you to do. But you do have to take the comments seriously and you do have to address them. When the editor or the letter says, reply to the review comment and says they suggest a table really is very helpful. Include every single reviewer comment in that table and then reply to every single comment. Say that you addressed it, say that you didn't address it and why you didn't address it, say that it's similar to another comment and so your response is further down in the table. This is a very important part of the conversation that you have with the editor that shows you took the reviewer comments seriously, you didn't just blow them off or ignore them, and that you have given a great deal of thought to the way that you are responding. And point 4, take a breather before you start and consider how the comments might help improve your article, even if your initial thought is that you disagree with them. And if you're unsure about exactly how you should treat the reviewer comments, or what you should do with the comments that you get, yes, write back to the editor and ask. From my perspective, at least, and I think most editors, part of our job is to help you understand what the reviewers expect, what you need to do to improve your article. We would not write back and ask you to make revisions if we didn't feel that there was some value and if we didn't feel it was worth the effort. So if you don't understand the reviewer comments, we really don't want you to waste your effort. Write to the editor and ask. All right, so let me just run you through a little bit of my thinking when I'm the editor and I receive an article. I look at the abstract. Does it fit the aims and scope? Is it clearly written? Is it relevant? Does it seem important? If yes, I look at the article. If no, it's an automatic reject. Then I look at the article. Does the length fit within our requirements? Has it been anonymized? Are the tables and figures where they're supposed to be? Based on the article, does it still fit the aims and scope? Is it still clearly written? Are all the components there? For example, is there a methodology section that I can find? If not, it's rejected. So this is really the thinking process. Abstract, if yes, carry on. If no, reject. Article, if yes, carry on. If no, reject. At this point, it will go on to my peer reviewers. There's always a balancing act between articles which have some new important information and the way that it is written. So I'm always kind of thinking how much work would actually have to be done to get this in shape so that new, relevant, important information can be conveyed. If it's a really impressive piece of research, but really poorly written, I have to think about how I could help the author get it into shape. If it's very well written, but it doesn't really have a new idea, it probably would be rejected. So the editorial process, once I get the reviews back, so I've already said I send it to the reviewers, they'll send back their comments. I look to see, do the reviewers agree or disagree with each other? And then do I agree or disagree with the comments that they made? Which comments do I agree or disagree with? If I see fundamental flaws in conceptualization, or if the reviewers comment on fundamental flaws in conceptualization, in methodology, or in the conclusions, that will lead to a rejection. And by fundamental flaws in the conclusions, one of the things that I want to point out is conclusions which are overblown are not very helpful to your article. Inadequate explanation of conceptualization method discussion is more likely to lead to a revise and resubmit. If the explanation seems to be inadequate, the reviewers can comment on what they didn't understand, what wasn't clear, what needs more information, and the author can add more explanation. But if it looks like the methodology really is flawed, more explanation will not help. So inadequate explanation typically lends to revise and resubmit. And this is where it can be very helpful to look carefully at the reviewer comments, because what they are telling you when they say you need to do X is, I didn't understand that part. So while to you as an author, it might be very clear, what they're trying to express to you is it wasn't clear to them, and it must be clear to them to be published. So then as the editor, I ask myself, can the article be improved? Based on the comments from the reviewers and based on what I read, do I see that this article could be improved and could be a valuable contribution? How much work would it take? Are we talking about 6 months work? Are we talking about starting from scratch? So I have to consider all of that before I make the decision. In this case, you see the editorial process isn't yes, no, but it's really a problem-solving process. What are the different issues? What would be the different solutions? How much effort does it take to get through those solutions? And finally, what I call the lowdown. I see that I'm using up my time, so let me just run through this. We go back to the Lee article where Lee said it has to represent an important problem. The question is, how do you set up an important problem? For me as an editor, this is the content. It's your responsibility to say what the problem is that you're addressing and to explain why it's important or relevant or worthwhile. And if that means you need to say the purpose of this article is da 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 da, this is important because da 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 da, it's fine to write that. It would be better to write that as opposed to leaving the information too vague or implicit. Do moderate your claims based on the data. As I was saying, an overblown conclusion can lead to a rejection. But don't moderate your claims on the value of your work. If you see this work as being truly valuable for some reason, say that. We want to know your opinion, because at the point that you submit, you are the only expert in the whole world on what you have done. And of course, do consider the relevance for international readership. How does the author frame the problem? This relates actually to organization instead of content. You have to have continuity between the abstract, the introduction, and the discussion section of the article. So if you say that you have an important problem that you are addressing in the abstract, when I read your introduction, I expect a beginning of an explanation about why that's an important problem. And when I get to the discussion, I expect it to tell me how you have addressed that important problem. If that important problem appears in the abstract but disappears before I get the discussion, that would be a rejection. All right. And in addition, there has to be cohesion in your argument. So what you present in the introduction as the rationale behind your work should reappear in the discussion so that I can see that rationale persists in the line of argument throughout the whole article. I'll give you a few examples from my own work as an author. You can see here, I check myself as I am working. This is a paper I published recently with Ivy Wu or Wu Ying. And you can see here that in the introduction, we said institutional identity attempts to balance, blah, 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 blah. And I just put a comment to myself, Rita, check this. Do you really do this? This is what I put while I was working on the draft article. And then this article concludes by, this is in the introduction. So I put a comment to myself, did you really do this? This way, when I get to the conclusion of the article, I can compare it with my introduction. I also do this then in the discussion. I actually cut and paste from the introduction. I tag it onto the discussion so I can see let a comparison for myself and make sure that by the end of the article, I did what I promised at the beginning. I do this as an author, I do this as a reviewer, and I do this as an editor. In the conclusion as well, I'm just checking. Did I do what I said I would do in the way that I said I would do it? Did I address the topic I said I would address? Is it carefully prepared? In this sense, it doesn't mean perfection, but did you show care and thought for your audience? Did you include details that make the context clear for international readers who don't know about the context you're working in? Did you include information that justify the conclusions that you came to? For example, perhaps a final example, a data excerpt. Did you clearly present your figures and tables so that people could understand them? And are they included for a reason that communicates some information and not just window dressing? And of course, in completing your response to reviewers, if you assume the reviewers are right, even when you're sure they're not, and you take into account the comments that they make, you show care and thought in your response to them, which shows that you are treating the whole enterprise seriously. And finally, written style, grammar, word choice, punctuation, of course, but also this idea of coherence and cohesion. It has to be consistent, logical, and understandable. The whole thing has to stick together. Again, that idea that I just showed you with my own author comments to myself. If I said I was going to do it in the abstract, did I talk about it in the introduction to explain what I meant? And by the time I get to the discussion or conclusion, did I actually do it? Also, try to anticipate reader questions, especially for context-specific information. In this example from our article, right, we talked about the different rankings of China's hierarchical university system. Not everybody knows about China's system. That wouldn't make sense, and so we would have to explain it. So try to do a final reading with an eye of someone who would not be familiar with your work or your context. Explanation is important. So you can see here geographic region, geopolitical background, ethnic minority region, where we make topical links across the ideas. And finally, repetition of key ideas. This article was about linguistic landscape. Sometimes authors think, oh, too much repetition is boring. So as an editor, I would say I prefer more repetition and more clarity. If you try to vary your wording too much, using synonyms, other ideas, too many pronouns, it becomes hard to follow your argument. So go for more repetition and more clarity, in my opinion. Okay, so these are the things that I have been talking about. And you can see on the right-hand side, I hope that this helps you think about making choices for where you want to disseminate your work, for choosing a journal appropriately, and also for understanding the process after you have submitted. There are a few references here. And if you're interested, I can actually send the slides, so you're welcome to have these. And then you would also be able to access the references. And thank you so much for listening to me. I've gone on for quite a while. I'm more than happy to turn it over to you and hear some questions.
Thank you so much, Rita, for a very detailed and inspiring presentation. I really like, the flow of the whole presentation, starting from something that's more general, but, seeing peer review as part of academic publishing and a lot of decision making to be done, and then going down to more specific tips related to various stages of peer review. I especially like, your suggestion on comparing different aims and scopes of different journals to kind of understand which journal suits you the most. I also like the kind of self feedback that you provide to yourself, kind of, because I think for early career researchers, we often think about asking other people for feedback, for example, our supervisors or senior colleagues, but it's also possible for us to kind of talk to ourselves, kind of remind ourselves about things that we need to do and to think about. So thank you so much, Rita. So I think we still have around 20 minutes, which I think is sufficient for questions or comments. So you can either type your questions in the chat, or you can click the raise hand button, and I should be able to call out your names. Yes. Tatum, please go ahead.
Okay, hello, Professor Rita. Is my voice clear? Hello?
I think, yeah, I can hear you, but I can also hear somebody else, I think, in the background, maybe.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, do we as editors have the right to recommend our authors to share their data? As you mentioned, open scholarship, all of amazing research going through it, but do we have the right to recommend that during the review? Or it might be suspicious or something? Sharing your data is still something that's not a very common practice in many contexts. Thank you.
I couldn't really get all that. I understood that the question was about sharing the topic was about sharing the data, but I'm not sure exactly what your question was.
Yeah, I think yeah. So if you can type that in the chat, that would be great. In the meantime, Jenny, I saw your hand up a while back. Do you have a question to ask, or?
Yes, hi. Thank you, Rita. That was really useful and very comprehensive. I've made loads of notes. That's excellent. Thank you. I wanted to ask you about submissions to other journals. If you are rejected by a journal, what's the protocol for submitting to a different journal?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I think the first rule is do it. If you're rejected by one journal, don't take that as the end. Take the comments that you have already received and submit to another journal. We expect that. We often see articles that we didn't accept for some reason appearing later. They're almost better. They're almost always better by then. I have heard some of my colleagues talk about being rejected as much as 7 times, which I hope you aren't, but definitely don't give it up. Take the comments that you got, work it over one more time, send it out to somebody else.
Right. Okay, so while Tatum is still typing, I have a question, Rita, and I think a lot of ECRs be quite interested in this. So imagine a doctoral researcher finishing his or her dissertation or thesis, and they're thinking about publishing parts of their dissertation to a journal, to your journal, for example. I wonder, what are some of the elements that you look for in a study that's part of a thesis? Because a lot of the students, I think they have a hard time thinking about what to include and what not to include. And I think it's 7,000 words for your journal, including the references. So from a massive thesis to a 7,000 word journal article, what are some elements that you are looking for as a journal editor?
Yeah, again, a super question, and one that's really pretty hard to deal with as a student. If you think about your thesis that you do for your PhD, when you do your thesis, what you're trying to demonstrate is that you have developed the scope of knowledge that makes you a qualified person to join the field. So it's always going to be, almost always going to be too big for a single publication. Of course, some do get turned into monographs, but even if you turn your thesis into a monograph, it's nice if you can have a couple of journal articles as well so that they can work together. The trick then for cutting off a piece to put into the journal article is to rethink your thesis not as that large problem that you started off with, But what is one piece of that? So let's imagine, I guess I like food metaphors, but instead of going out for that, 8-course dinner at the French restaurant, which is your thesis, what you're doing is going to the local restaurant with your family and having a decent meal. Because of course, we want some journal articles that, shake the world, but we also need a lot of journal articles that are solid research that moves the field forward. So you're going to look at your research, pick one issue, pick one part of the question, and use your journal article to discuss that point. There are a few warnings that go along with this. Often when you submit your journal article to a journal, we run articles through a similarity check. And so many theses are now published online. We might get a high similarity check. We will know when we look at the details, it's because it's from your thesis. This is a case where it's a very good idea to include a cover letter that says it's from your thesis, that you have not published it elsewhere, and that this is just one part of the whole. That's one warning. The second warning is you want to avoid what we call salami slicing, which is cutting it so thin into such little bitty pieces that you no longer have anything important to say, or the articles appear too similar to each other. So you have to find that nice place between too big and too small. But I hope that helps you think about it.
Thank you, Rita. I think Tadmas typed her question. So her question was to do with whether editors have the right, or is it okay for editors to recommend authors? I think that's authors to share the data. I think data sharing is still a new thing. At least it's not something my lecturers or authors would think it's favorable.
This is just a really good question. Again, in terms of, do editors have the right to recommend sharing data? As an editor, I feel fine recommending that you share your data. What I don't feel fine with is requiring you to share your data. So I think there are very good reasons for sharing data, and I think there are very good ways to share data now. For example, when you share data, if you set up Open Science Foundation account and you put in your data there, you get you know how many people have downloaded it, and you can get some information about how it's used. So I think that's really great and really helpful to us as researchers. But do I want to require you to do it? No, this is your work. I don't feel I could ever insist that you must make it available. I think it's more than through a reward system. As I said, for language and education, we do have open science badges, and we have one for open data. So if you decide to do that, you can get an open science badge, but I'm not going to say that you have to.
Okay. I wonder, Rita, how often do people take on those offers, like invitations to be open with their data? I mean, you have the badges on your journal website, of course, but how often do people really claim those? And
Not very often. It's really new. People tend to prefer open access because, of course, they see the advantage to open access in terms of disseminating their work more broadly. Open data, right, just as in the comment, is something that people are still a bit leery about. And there are a few reasons. People can sometimes be worried about getting scooped. Oh, somebody else will use my data and write the article I wanted to write before I did. Honestly speaking, this isn't a serious issue in our field. In the hard sciences, sometimes it can be an issue because you tend to have internationally several competing groups working on the same problem. But in applied linguistics, we do so many things in so many different ways. It's highly unlikely that somebody's going to get your data out of the repository and write the article you wanted to write. What can happen is that people might interpret your data in a different way, and you might not be comfortable with that. And this is where it's very important to have clear protocols about what you did and why you did it. So I always recommend that people not only publish their data, but also publish their protocols. For example, if here's your interview data, when you write the methodology section of your article, it's like we did interviews with 20 people for 1 hour each. They were unstructured. But that's not really your protocol that you use. So I always recommend that people publish the more detailed protocol along with their data, so that people have a better understanding of where the data was generated.
thank you. Jenny, go ahead, please.
Yes, I just wanted to say that at my university, the consent form includes a box to tick if you are happy for your data to be shared on a data platform. And not all of my participants ticked that box. So, and at this stage, you know, I'm writing up my thesis and thinking about publication. At this stage, I feel it's safer just to leave all of the data ring-fenced, as it were, and out of the public domain, rather than release some people's data in, you know, and leave others out. It's quite hard, isn't it, really? So, but that's interesting that my university has chosen to do that in an attempt to get the data more accessible, perhaps. Thank you.
We see the universities worldwide going more toward encouraging people in ways of what we consider open science initiatives, not only open access, but also open data sharing. So my university, for example, now mandates that we must share our articles as soon as they're published. But they don't pay the money for us to have open access. So that means we publish our preprints, and they also encourage us to share our data. We have repositories on campus that allow us to share our data. And my university's policy is actually, if the data are anonymized, they can be shared without explicit permission. But if I'm going to share the identity of the participant, I must have explicit permission. And that means we have to do very careful checks, not only for things like names, but also contextual information that could reveal identities, especially a context like Singapore, which is, you know, a small country. And so as soon as you start to talk about, for example, a school that specializes in the arts, I mean, there's only one. So we do have to be very careful as well about contextual information that could reveal identities. I'll share one more story about data sharing and identities as well, because when I was doing one study with Singapore teachers some years ago, at the end of the study, I asked them, I did a reconsent procedure to ask them if they'd be willing to share their data. And I didn't ask them at the beginning because at the beginning they didn't really know what was going to happen. So by the end of it, they knew what they had done. And I asked them, for example, can I show your videos when I'm doing teacher training? Can I show excerpts of your videos at international conferences? Can I use excerpts of the audio recordings at international conferences? And several of the teachers said, you can use my data only at international conferences, but not with any of your pre-service teachers, because those teachers might then come to my school and I might be their supervisor. And I don't want them, you know, to be critiquing my teaching before they come to my school. So it was a very interesting discussion about what could be shared with whom and when.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other question from the audience? If not, I would just ask one final question, if that's okay, Rita. So again, asking on behalf of early career researchers. So when we think about publication strategy, we think about, you know, of course, where to publish, as you mentioned at the top, but also I think when to publish. And a lot of the students who are doing their PhD, they were thinking about publishing after or very near to the end of their study. Whereas I know there are supervisors who encourage students to publish along the way. But at the same time, there are concerns from the students that if it's a piece of work in progress and if reviewers and editors know that it's a PhD thesis, they may have, you know, more hurdles to go through than other manuscripts. I wonder what's your take on this in terms of not just where to publish, but when is a good time to publish our work?
I don't think that editors would be disparaging of something just because they knew it was from a graduate student or just because they knew that it was a study that's still ongoing. From very experienced scholars, we get articles all the time from work that is still ongoing. I always encourage my graduate students to publish while they are still graduate students. It's such an important part of the learning experience. And I feel that it's also now critical for getting a job, honestly. There's no question the environment is more competitive than when I came up, and that having some publications is very useful. If you feel hesitant, you could start by doing a couple book reviews about books that you're going to read anyway for your thesis, and we're happy to talk with you about publishing book reviews. You can think about publishing a lit review or a critical research synthesis that was part of your lit review for your thesis. You can start to think about maybe publishing a case study from your larger study. I would say start to think about that as soon as you can. You need to learn to make writing and publishing a part of your academic life.
Thank you. It's good to know that it's not too early to start. So
Yeah.
yeah, thank you. Thank you. All right. So if there is no question, oh, yes, Rita.
Well, actually, if you don't mind me taking a minute, I thought I would just share one more quick thing. Let me share my
Sure.
other screen. This is something I usually share with my colleagues. But because we talked about sharing data and also this idea of like tracking which data could be shared and which data cannot be shared, there's all kinds of project management software that you can use, and there are features built into some packages that you can use to track your data. I find none of them actually do what I want, which is simply tell me which data was collected when, by whom, and what's been done to it. And I make an Excel sheet for every project I run. I give access to my RAs to it. So here you can see we collected from Teacher One an interview on 2nd September. RA1 collected it. That's very important because if I have questions, I need to go back to the person that collected it. Does it have an audio recording? Yes. What's the file name for the audio recording so we can find it later? Has it been anonymized? Because you can anonymize audio recordings. No, it hasn't been. Does it have a transcript? Yes. What's the file name for the transcript? Has the transcript been anonymized? So I can keep track of which of my data is ready to share because it's anonymized. I would add to this a column about like in Jenny's situation, did the person give permission to share or not share? I do this all the way through data collection, all the way through data analysis, so that at the end of the project, I know what data I have, I know what the file names are called, I know if they've been anonymized or not, I know if they have any problems. It's like a stupid, simple way to keep track of things, and it's tedious. We do this every Friday. Every Friday morning, every member of my research team has to go back and fill in the Excel sheet. And then every Friday afternoon, if I see an empty space, like in cell D4, I write back to RA2 and say, why is cell D4 empty? And they can then tell me quickly what's going. So I can see where I am with my project as well. But super important for later, because at my university now we have to archive all of our research data when our project is complete for 10 years. And we have to be able to show that we have in fact archived all of the data.
Thank you, Rita. That's very helpful and a very useful example. Nor has a question. She asks, as an early career researcher, I'm in my final year and intending to publish. I interviewed different groups of stakeholders because my aim was to solicit different perceptions. So for my publication, I chose one particular contribution I will make to write the manuscript around. I felt the urge, however, to include perceptions of other stakeholders, even when it was not very necessary. What is your advice on this?
So this is a case where it's really hard to tell without reading the article, but I think it goes back to this idea of what I was talking about, being consistent in the purpose of your article throughout the whole article. If to make your point, you feel that you need to include evidence from the other stakeholders, or you need to be able to show some of the contrary evidence to be sure that your data is really trustworthy, then I would say yes, you should include those. But if you are including those just because of some, I don't know, sense of fairness or something, it doesn't work that way. You don't have to include them just because you have the data. So you'd only include them if it fits some purpose of the article that you're working on.
Okay, great. So thank you again, Rita, for the presentation and also for answering our questions. And I know it's way past work hours in Singapore. So really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And for those attending, thank you again for joining us this early if you're in the UK. Do spread the word because this event is recorded. And so please let your colleagues know that they can always access the recordings if they are BERA members on our website. So this marks the end and an excellent close of our webinar series for this year. So stay tuned for more events from the network, and I hope to see everybody in future events. Thank you very much and have a nice day.